You're driving normally when the oil pressure warning light suddenly appears. The engine may still sound fine, but inside, critical components are already being starved of lubrication. So what begins to fail first, and how quickly can a small pressure loss destroy the entire engine? We're going to look inside and follow the damage from the first warning sign to complete engine failure. Before we follow the damage, you need to understand one idea, because it's the reason this particular warning light is so serious. Inside your engine, metal parts are spinning and sliding against other metal parts at incredible speed, thousands of times a minute. If that metal ever actually touched other metal directly, it would grind itself to pieces in seconds. The only thing preventing that is a microscopically thin film of oil, a slippery cushion that keeps those surfaces from ever making contact. And here's the key. It isn't just the oil that saves your engine. It's the oil under pressure. That pressure is what forces the oil into the tiniest gaps and holds those parts apart against enormous force. So oil pressure isn't a maintenance detail. It is the only thing standing between a smooth-running engine and metal tearing itself apart. When that pressure drops, that protective cushion collapses. And that is why this is one of the few warning lights that means stop the engine now. Unlike most warnings, oil pressure is not a get it checked soon light. It's a pull over and shut it off light, because the damage happens in minutes, sometimes seconds, not days. Remember that, because everything we're about to see is the reason why. Now let's look at where the damage strikes first, because not all parts of the engine fail at the same rate. When oil pressure drops, the components that fail first are the ones that were relying on that pressure the most, the parts under the heaviest load with the tightest clearances. And at the very top of that list are the engine bearings. These are the surfaces where the spinning crankshaft and connecting rods ride, the parts carrying the full, violent force of combustion. In a healthy engine, these parts never actually touch. They float on a thin wedge of pressurized oil, a gap so small it's measured in fractions of a hair's width. That oil wedge is entirely dependent on pressure to exist. So the instant pressure falls, that wedge is the first thing to collapse. And the crankshaft, which was floating, drops onto the bearing and begins to grind metal on metal. This is why the bearings are almost always the first casualties. They had the least room for error and the highest load to carry. And this is where a small problem becomes a catastrophe, and it happens astonishingly fast. The moment metal touches metal at those bearings, two things ignite the spiral. First, friction. And friction instantly means heat. Intense, localized heat right where the parts are grinding. Second, that grinding tears tiny particles of metal off the surfaces, and those particles get swept into the oil, turning your lubricant into a grinding paste that damages everything else it flows through. And here's the vicious part. The heat from the grinding makes the remaining oil even thinner, which drops the pressure further, which means even less protection, which means more grinding, more heat, more metal in the oil. It's a runaway loop, and unlike a slow leak, this one measures its lifespan in seconds and minutes. This is the fundamental reason oil pressure loss is so uniquely destructive. The failure actively accelerates itself, and it does it faster than almost any other failure in your car. That covers what fails first and why it snowballs. Now let's follow the problem backward, because the warning light tells you the pressure is gone, but it doesn't tell you why, and there are a few very different culprits. The first and simplest is that you're just low on oil. Pressure is created by a pump pushing oil through the engine, and a pump can only push what's actually there. If a leak or heavy oil burning has dropped the level too low, the pump starts sucking air along with oil, and pressure crashes. This is the most common cause, and also the most preventable, which is exactly why checking your oil level matters. The second culprit is the oil pump itself. This pump is the heart of the entire system, the single component generating all your pressure, and if it wears out or fails, pressure drops even with a full, healthy supply of oil. The third is old, degraded oil. Over time and heat, oil breaks down and gets thinner, and thin oil can't hold pressure or maintain that protective film the way fresh oil does, which is one more reason oil changes aren't just a suggestion. And the fourth is a clog. If the oil filter or the narrow internal passages get blocked with sludge from oil that was left in far too long, the oil physically can't reach the parts that need it, and pressure at those starved parts collapses even though the pump is working fine. So let's put the whole chain together. From that first light to a dead engine, it typically runs like this. Pressure drops for any of those reasons. The oil wedge at the bearings collapses. The crankshaft drops and metal begins grinding on metal. That grinding creates heat and sheds metal particles into the oil. The contaminated, overheating oil thins further and protects even less, so the grinding spreads from the bearings to the camshaft, the pistons, the cylinder walls. And the final stage is catastrophic and often sudden. A bearing can seize, locking onto the crankshaft, or a connecting rod, starved and overheated, can snap and literally punch a hole through the side of the engine block, what mechanics grimly call throwing a rod. At that point, the engine is not repairable. It's scrap. And the entire journey from that first flickering warning light to a destroyed engine can happen in the time it takes to finish a short drive, if you keep driving. Which is exactly why the single most valuable thing in this whole video is knowing what to do the instant that light appears. If the oil pressure light comes on, especially a solid red one, the correct response is immediate. Safely pull over and shut the engine off as soon as you possibly can. Do not drive it just a little farther to get home. Do not rev it to see if the light clears. Every additional second the engine runs without pressure is doing permanent accelerating damage. Shutting it off early might mean the difference between adding a quart of oil and buying a new engine. There is almost no other warning light where the few seconds of your reaction time matter this much. And once it's off and safe, the early clues and simple checks are worth knowing. The bonus round. Sometimes there are warning signs before the light even comes on. A faint ticking or knocking noise from the engine is often the sound of parts that are already starting to run dry. Metal beginning to tap against metal. If you ever hear a new tapping or knocking, treat it seriously. And the simplest prevention of all costs nothing. Check your oil level regularly with the dipstick, because catching a low level early, before the light ever appears, is free, and it prevents the entire disaster we just described. A leak that drips a little today can empty an engine over weeks, and the dipstick will warn you long before the dashboard does. That is how an engine dies when it loses oil pressure, from a thin film of protection collapsing to bearings grinding, to heat and metal feeding a spiral that can wreck the entire engine in minutes, which is exactly why that one small light demands that you stop now, and why it's the one warning you should never, ever drive through. If this helped you understand what happens when an engine loses oil pressure, go ahead and subscribe for more car breakdowns. Next, we can break down how your engine's lubrication system works from the ground up, what your other dashboard warning lights are really telling you, or how the cooling system fights the heat that oil can't handle alone. The more you understand what's happening under the hood, the better decisions you can make as a car owner. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.